Hello everybody, and welcome to this Ikoria draft guide. Before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with any questions or feedback. Without further ado, let's dive in. In this video, we are going to be covering the top 3 commons for each color. We're going to be going over the color rankings, the archetypes, and ranking those, the combat tricks in the set, and then finally going to be covering some traps and combos, as well as how good the fixing is in the set, and some final format tips. Let's dive into the colors. Starting with white, at number 1 is Pacifism. This is just a very efficient removal spell that you're going to be happy playing in all of your white decks. At number 2 is Snare Tactician. Again, it can play both sides of the ball. It's good in aggressive decks to tap down blockers, and good in defensive decks to tap down attackers, so I really am excited to be playing with these, and once you get multiples in play, it truly is a devastating card. Next up is Divine Arrow. 4 damage is a lot, especially in this set. Cycling will make it so your opponent suspects you less when you hold up mana on their turn, so Divine Arrow is going to be even better than normal, and I think it is going to be a premium common. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Essence Scatter. In a format all about getting big creatures into play, Essence Scatter is a cheap way to prevent all of those shenanigans, and I think it is a high pick as a result. At number 2 is Dreamtail Heron. It replaces itself when it mutates, and is also good just to cast as a 5-mana 3/4 flyer, so this card is going to be a very high pick, and definitely going to be good in mutate decks and just in normal decks of the format. At number 3 is Gust of Wind. When you can cast this for 2 mana, it's going to feel completely broken, and that's not that hard to do, and at 4 mana, it's still a solid card. If you bounce a mutate creature, both parts go back to their hand, so you can really get ahead on mana, even though it does cost 4 in a lot of cases, and you're never going to be down a card because you do draw upon casting it, so definitely going to be a great common. Moving on to black, at the number 1 spot is Blood Curdle, unconditional removal, and you get a menace counter to boot. It's also highly splashable, so definitely worth an early pick. At number 2 is Dead Weight. This card is cheap. It can kill the mutate creatures before they can mutate onto them, which can definitely slow your opponents down, and it also is great at taking down those aggressive decks before they can get the ball rolling. At number 3 is Boot Nipper, and while most of the time you will choose Deathtouch, as that lets it trade with any of the fearsome creatures running around in the format, sometimes you'll want lifelink so that you can mutate one of your bigger creatures onto it and stabilize the board. So that flexibility makes Boot Nipper a little bit better, and definitely worth its spot in the top 3 commons for black. Moving on to red, we start things off with Fire Prophecy. This is a very potent removal spell. Deals 3 damage and lets you rummage by discarding a card to the bottom of your deck. I guess that's not technically discard, but essentially discard, and lets you draw a card, helps you find your lands in the early game, and discard your extra lands in the late game, so very potent a card to have for sure. And next is Rumbling Rockslide. I really like this card as it scales so well with the game. It's a 4-mana deal 4 on turn 4, and in the late game it kills basically everything, and because you're going to be playing against an opponent that also is playing 1 land per turn, it tends to scale with what your opponent does. So when your opponent has 5 lands and plays their 5/5, you will play your 5th land, and your Rumbling Rockslide will still be a potent removal spell. So I really like this one, and it is also definitely one that you could look to splash in your decks that have the fixing necessary. At number 3 is Prickly Marmoset, and this is one scary monkey. If you're trying to block this, you're always going to be afraid of your opponent cycling a card and making it a 4/3 first striker, and sometimes you can even cycle it twice to just hit them for 6 out of nowhere. Definitely a card that is good on offense and also deceptively good on defense, so one that you'll want to keep your eye out for. He's definitely keeping his eyes out for you. Next, moving on to green, we start things off with Ram Through. This is a very potent removal spell for green. Normally green gets a fight spell, but this one is just a straight up punch. Your opponent's creature doesn't get any say in it, doesn't do damage back to your creature, which makes this potent, especially at instant speed when you cast this mid-combat. So definitely one that is very powerful and one to keep your eye out for. Number 2 is Essence Symbiote. This is going to be a great creature in the mutate decks, and a very potent card not only to mutate onto because it is a non-human, but also if it's just sitting in play when you're mutating onto something else, you're going to be very happy to have Essence Symbiote, and it only gets scarier in multiples. At the 3 slot is Migratory Greathorn. This card fixes your mana, it makes you a big creature that can come in very early in the game, and also is just going to be a fantastic card to trigger other mutates because it doesn't put you down a card. Getting a land into play will ramp your mana and help you play your 5-drops ahead of schedule potentially. Very excited to be playing with the Greathorn, and I'm looking forward to using it to fix my mana and ramp into bigger payoffs. Moving on to the color rankings, the best color is going to be blue, followed by red, then white, then green, and black at the bottom. None of the colors are bad per se. I just think that this is going to be the ranking that I would choose. And I do want to note that it is not as if black is unplayable or blue is miles ahead and you should force it every time. You still want to be drafting the open colors at your seat, but if you have a tiebreaker pick or you have the option to choose to go into one of these colors, I would recommend going towards the blue and the red rather than the green and the black. The problem with black is it just doesn't have as deep of commons. Some of the commons just kind of fall off, whereas blue has some very potent combos all the way through and you're going to be happy even going to like the 6th and 7th best common, whereas black, at that point, you're kind of scrounging to hit cards that you're happy to put in your deck. So yeah, this is the ranking and that I would choose, and I think that it can be used as a tiebreaker, though in most limited draft situations, you're just going to be like trying to find the open lane because there is no color that is objectively so much worse than the others or so much better that you should be forcing that color. Moving on to some archetype tier lists here. In the top tier, start things off with a blue-green. This is going to be a mutate deck, and is going to be a very potent one at that. There are some very powerful cards, and you're also able to splash very effectively in the blue-green deck, so you can get the premium removal from other colors and slot it right into your blue-green deck. So I think blue-green is going to be a fantastic deck. At number 2 is the red-white aggressive deck. There are some very good cycling payoffs for this deck, and as a result, I think it's going to be very scary to play against, as there is not only the aggressive element, but also the fact that it's harder for it to run out of good plays to make even in the late game. At number 3 is the blue-red deck. I think this card is going to be great because not only does cycling help you fuel your instants and sorceries in the graveyard type cards, but it also means there's also just a lot of great instants and sorceries in red. Red and blue are the two best colors after all, and so there's just high card quality in this deck, and I think that that will make it a very potent deck that you're going to look to be drafting. In the mid-tier, red-green is going to be a creatures-based deck. It just wants to play big things, and some of the cards have care a little bit extra about trample, but you're just going to want to be playing big creatures in a format that is designed around big creatures, so it's definitely going to be a scary one for sure. Next is white-black. This color combination has some really good removal options and also has some additional human synergies and some synergies for going wide, which is going to make it a very scary deck, especially for decks that are trying to just go all in on one big mutate creature. Having to deal with 5 small creatures might be difficult for them. And you're definitely going to want to prioritize the Anthem effect that I will cover later, the +2/+1 for all your creatures, if you're in white-black and have a way to make a lot of 1/1 creatures. Moving on to blue-white, this is going to be an evasive deck, a flyers deck, and a tempo-based deck a lot of the time. There are some cards that really reward you for playing this style of deck, cards that can both give your creatures flying and also reward you for having flying on your creatures, and as a result, the blue-white deck is going to be one of the more irritating decks to face if you're a deck that is a little bit clunky. Next is red-black. This deck not only cares about menace, but also cares about sacrifice, and there are some sacrifice synergies that can be very deadly, so keep your eye out for those if you're playing red-black, and also just pick those removal spells, take them, kill your opponent's big creatures, and profit from it. Moving on to the low-tier decks, I do want to stress again that these decks are by no means unplayable, and if they are open, I will happily draft them, but if you have the choice between like a close pick that can put you into a mid or top tier deck and a low tier deck, I would lean towards the mid and top tier, of course. Black-green is going to be a graveyard-based deck, and while there are many ways to put cards into the graveyard, there are fewer ways to get value out of the graveyard. So in this deck, it's very uncommon-based and can actually be very powerful if you do have the uncommons to support it, but you do need to make sure you get those uncommons that reward you for having a stocked graveyard and can get you some value out of that graveyard rather than just putting cards in for no purpose. Next is blue-black control, and the pieces are definitely here if you can get them, but it is going to be less reliable than some of the other decks because you just need to rely on card quality to a large degree in the blue-black deck rather than some of the more potent synergies that they're pushing for the other color combinations. So I think blue-black, again, can be a very good deck, but it's going to be a little bit less reliable. And then finally is green-white. It's got a slight vigilance sub-theme, but I think mostly it's going to get there just playing big creatures and hoping for the best, just relying on overall high card quality. If green and white are open and you're getting good cards in those colors, some of the top commons, you can definitely find a good deck. There's also the opportunities to splash in any of these green decks, but green-white can sometimes just be we'll play some green cards, play some white cards, and then maybe splash some good red removal spells or some black removal spells and try to get by like that. and that can be your strategy for green-white, or maybe you just open a good green or white rare and just kind of go in for that. Moving on to some combat tricks, there are a lot of these, so I'm not going to be covering them in a ton of detail, just going to be showing them off, mentioning what they do briefly a little bit, so that you can be aware of these, and in your own drafts, especially so you don't get blown out in your first couple drafts by, oh, I didn't know that card existed. Coordinated Charge, however, is a big combat trick to be aware of. If your opponent makes a suspicious attack with all of their creatures, this is the first card that should come to your mind, +2/+1, and it has cycling, which makes it so that your opponent is never really going to cut this card from their deck, so it will see play in a lot of situations, and a lot of decks are going to want this card, so keep it in mind when your opponent makes a suspicious attack. Fight as 1 can really protect their creatures from removal spells, so if they've been holding up 1 mana all game, I don't think I'd play around Fight as 1 until I'd seen it, but if you have the opportunity to, you might as well. Next is Light of Hope. I think it's more of a sideboard card, but definitely one that you don't want to lose to because it is only a single counter, so maybe throw an extra creature onto the block. Solid Footing can be really scary, especially if your opponent is playing that green-white Vigilance deck, because there are some pretty scary creatures that have that are 1/4s or 3/6s that'll get a ton of stats from Solid Footing, and it is flash, so you want to keep that in mind, and you don't want your opponent to keep their creature around and also be killing a bunch of yours in combat. So Solid Footing is definitely one that you'll want to have in mind whenever your opponent makes a suspicious attack with like a 1/4 Vigilance into your board full of 2/2s. Next is Spontaneous Flight. This is one to be afraid of, especially if you're a more controlling deck and your opponent has gotten you down to like 5 life. If they make an attack that might put you down to a scary life total against a flyer and you don't have any reach, you'll want to make sure you make some blocks so you don't die to a Spontaneous Flight, giving the creature flying and then having to deal with that flyer later. So, because Spontaneous Flight, even on a 3/3, can take you down from 8 life in only 2 turns, so it's a really scary card in those situations. Next is Will of the All Hunter. Again, it's an uncommon, so this isn't one you'll have to play around as much, but definitely one to be aware of. I do want to stress that I think it is most beneficial to you to use this on offense rather than defense. Even though the counters are permanent on defense, your opponent will have all of their mana up when you're on defense, which means they can punish you with removal spells. If you're using this when you're attacking them and they're tapped out, that's when you want to really get the value out of Will of the All Hunter. It's also got cycling, which also makes it just great. On to the blue cards, though there are going to be blue cards at the end that I forgot to add in this part of the section. Hampering Snare is one to be aware of, especially if you're going for a coordinated charge play, but overall it's going to mostly be cycled, and I feel like we'll have fringe uses in game. Next is Mystic Subdual. Again, I don't think it's super powerful. 2 mana for -2/-0 is just not efficient, so I'd recommend avoiding this card. Pouncing Shore Shark can be a really scary tempo swing, especially on the defensive side of things, where they mutate into this and make some blocks, or even on offense where you block their 2/2 with your 2/2, and all of a sudden you're facing down a 4/3 and your bigger creature got blocked. So Pouncing Shore Shark, definitely one to be aware of if your opponent has made some suspicious attacks and are in blue. Starting Development is going to be a card that you see all the time because it cycles for only 1 mana, which means it's very low cost to put in your deck, and so a lot of people are going to be playing this card, and you're going to want to be aware of it if you're making some blocks on creatures and you want to make sure yours stay alive. Moving on to black. Black has a lot of cards that interact with combat. Blitzleech is definitely one that can be flashed in before blockers, kill a smaller blocker, kill your bigger creature, so you don't want to get wrecked by that. If they're holding up 6 mana, Blitzleech comes to mind immediately. Lurking Deadeye, again, is just really irritating to play against. It really punishes you for not blocking on suspicious attacks, so if they attack you, they're 2/2 in, and all you have is a 5/5, maybe wait until you can play your 2/3, so you don't lose your big creature to a Lurking Deadeye. Next is Unexpected Fangs. This is only really a scary card for the aggressive decks, because +1/+1 is not all that good, but giving it lifelink can be game-ending if they put it on their 5/5 creature or something like that, so keep it in mind if you are aggressive. Unlikely Aid, not going to be played that much, I do not think. You don't really need to worry about it as much because it is a little bit clunky and didn't get played that much last time it was around in War of the Spark, but it is still going to give Indestructible and can be a fine sideboard card against heavy removal decks that rely on things like Blood Curdle. So if they do have 2 mana up and you're considering Blood Curdling, if you have other options, maybe consider those. Void Beckoner is like a Blade Brand variant that costs 1 more mana. Usually the creature you use this on isn't going to live through because you want to use it on a small creature that will then be able to kill a bigger creature in combat, though in some situations you will be putting this on like a 1/4 and then it is actually quite potent. So choose your targets wisely for Void Beckoner. Low power, high toughness cards will be best for it, and it is just a very good card. thanks to its 8 mana option as well. So I think it is one you'll see a lot, even though it is uncommon. Clash of Titans is next. It's not strictly a combat trick, but it is a card that I would like you to consider every time your opponent makes a weird attack or you're considering attacking and they have 5 mana up with double red, because this card can single-handedly end the game if you don't keep it in mind. Maybe you go for a pump spell on one of your creatures, and then your creatures just end up being both 6/6s and they fight each other and they just both die. You really don't want that to happen if your opponent is holding up that 5 mana, especially if you've seen this before, keep it in mind. Or if you're drafting at FNM and you like open this and pass it around the table, someone's going to have the card, and you just want to make sure you have that in the back of your head. Heightened Reflexes is next. We've seen this type of effect without leaving behind permanent first strike, and because of the first strike counter, I think it's going to be much better than normal. If you do have Deathtouch creatures, Heightened Reflexes gets better, but overall, it's going to be a relatively scary card, and only costs 1 mana. So I don't think it's going to be played an insane amount, but it's definitely one to keep in mind, especially with Deathtouch creatures. That's when it really becomes scary. Next is Raking Claws. Again, not a very powerful card, but works well with Deathtouch and works well with just spells matter cards because it does have cycling, so you can get it to your graveyard very easily. Next is Sanctuary Smasher. It's similar to Raking Claws, but it's much better because having the option to cast this as a 6 mana 6/4 is going to be very potent, and giving first strike to one of your big creatures for cheap is also going to be a nice option. Moving on to the green cards, Fully Grown is going to be great for giving trample to some of the big creatures that don't have it already. A lot of the creatures actually don't have trample, probably because they designed it so that Fully Grown would be a nice combo with them. And I think even though it costs 3 mana, that trample counter can actually really make it worth it. Make sure you're playing this in decks that have bigger creatures, as it works, even though a lot of combat tricks work well with small creatures like 2/2s and 3/3s, this is one that works very well with your bigger creatures because you're going to push through a ton of damage on the turns you use your Fully Grown on your 6/6. Moving on to the final combat tricks, Sudden Spinnerets I think is more of a sideboard card, but in the right matchup it can be quite potent, so keep it in mind if you're a Flyers deck post-board games. Thwart the Enemy, another one, just have it in the back of your head. If you're going to make an attack on your opponent and they have this mana up, think about whether you just lose to the card. Oftentimes, I don't think it's worth playing around Thwart the Enemy until you've seen it, because I don't think it's going to be played all that much, but it is the type of card that can single-handedly lose you a close game, so do consider it a little bit at least. These are the cards that I forgot about when I was going through the first time, so next is Aven Oddity. It's really just kind of like giving a creature reach if you're trying to use it as a combat trick. I don't think it's going to come up all that much, which is why I didn't mention it earlier, but if you are going to be attacking with a small utility flyer and they're holding up the mana, just think about it a little bit, especially if you've seen this card in previous games, just stuff like that. Next is Crustacean. Again, attacking small utility creatures into Crustacean, Adaptive Shimmerer, or Cunning Nightbonder. If you have like a 2/2 or a 1/1 and you're considering attacking it in, maybe just and you really want to keep that creature around for mutate purposes or things like that, maybe it's just not worth that 1 point of damage. Moving on to some traps and combos, we're going to start off with the traps. I think Whisper Squad is a trap, really not worth going for. Even if you get a bunch of them, you're filling your deck with bad cards to draw because 1 mana 1/1 isn't great. It's also a human, which means you can't mutate onto it, which even though humans, it cares about having them in play and stuff, having a lot of 1/1s, I still don't think it's going to be worth it and not going to be worth picking these cards. Next is Blade Banish. I don't think it's a bad card. I want to emphasize it is not a bad card. It is just not going to be a great main deckable card, I do not think. Even though the headline mechanic is mutate, there are still going to be a lot of cards that this just doesn't hit, and a lot of decks that do not care about Blade Banish, which means that even though it'll sometimes hit a really good threat, and it'll feel really good when it does that, in most situations it's going to be better as a potent sideboard card rather than as a main deck option, especially if you're a proactive deck where every card you have counts. We're coming off of a set, Theros Beyond Death, where this card was this type of effect was a fine main deck option because there were so many auras to buff up the creatures. But in this set, even though Mutate is kind of like an aura, I just do not think Blade Banish is going to be a card that you're looking to play in the main deck most of the time. Next is Escape Protocol. This card has definitely got some uses, but you want to make sure you have the right deck for it and that you have enough cycling to support it, because otherwise I could see people playing this card too often in decks that just can't support it. So you want to make sure Escape Protocol is actually good in your deck. You want to have 8 to 10 cyclers that you can use to trigger it, and a few enters the battlefield triggers before you're happy playing Escape Protocol, which is going to come up very rarely, I think. Next up is Gloom Pangolin. I just do not like the stat line really on this creature. Even though there aren't a ton of creatures that can necessarily get through as easily, The fact that it'll brickball those creatures, but only for a time, because your opponent's eventually going to find a creature to mutate on and then just break through the Gloom Pangolin wall. I just kind of wanted to, I think it's going to be an underwhelming card that gets played too much, so just wanted to highlight that here. Moving on to some combos, one of the most potent combos available to the red-black deck is going to be Tentative Connection plus a Sacrifice Outlet. That Sacrifice Outlet can be Mutual Destruction, but there are a number of them available to black and also in red. But the key card here is the Tentative Connection, because if you have a Menace creature, it is only 1 mana to steal their creature. You can then hit them with it, and then instead of giving it back at the end of turn, you will sacrifice that creature with something like Mutual Destruction for some amount of value. And if you use Mutual Destruction, you do kill one of your opponent's creatures as well. So for a red and a black, if you have that Menace creature, you will be able to steal their creature, attack them with it, and then sacrifice that creature to kill another one of their creatures, which is overall just going to be a very efficient combo. You don't have to prioritize the Tentative Connection, because if you are in the right deck, you're the only one that really wants it, because most decks don't really want that type of effect. Only really red black sacrifice will want it. But so the Tentative Connection is the real payoff to the combo there. Next up is Thieving Otter and Dreamtail Heron. This is going to be a combo that is very scary, and definitely one that if you have a couple Dreamtail Herons, prioritize Thieving Otter a little bit, because it can definitely give you some free wins. You immediately get a 3/4 flyer in the air that has already drawn you a card, so you're not going to be too far down on cards. As soon as you hit them, you've got card parity, and then you're just left with a 3/4 flyer that whenever it hits them, it draws you an extra card, and that is really just a lethal threat. Other cards that can give Thieving Otter flying are also nice combos with it, because drawing an extra card every turn and getting in some damage is not to be undervalued. Moving on to the fixing in the set, there are several ways to fix your mana at colorless. There is Tranquil Cove here to represent all of the gain lands. Gain lands will show up in 10 out of 24 packs, which means in a draft you can expect to see 10 gain lands on average. There is Evolving Wilds in the common slot, and also there is the Crystal Cycle at uncommon, 1 for each clan from Tarkir. So you can remember those. There's Jeskai, Mardu, Abzan, Temur, and Sultai. Those are the ways to fix your mana at colorless, and they are actually quite potent, and they're going to enable splashes for a variety of decks. If you open a 3-color rare that is not in green, you should still expect to be able to splash it if you prioritize these fixing cards, and even take fixing over cards that are, the land fixing that is, over cards that are like replacement level for your deck, because having an 8/8 with an Evolving Wilds is going to really do wonders for your mana, or 8/8 with a gain land in your color. That extra life and the mana fixing is definitely going to be worth the benefit, the cost of having the land come in tapped. And if you are in green, you're going to have access to a ton of fixing. In addition to the fixing shown here, the Fertilid, Humble Naturalist, and Migration Path, you're going to have access to things like Migratory Greathorn, which we've already looked at in the top 3 green commons, to fix your mana and splash a ton of cards. I think the green decks are going to be able to get those removal spells into their deck more frequently and splash very potent threats in potent removal spells, potent threats sometimes, if they really do need it. One thing I will note is that when you are splashing one card, typically what you're looking for is 3 sources, and I would like to stress that when you're splashing and you're using creatures to splash, each creature that you're using to splash will count as like half a source, because it can die, it can be an unreliable source, you'll want to block with it, and you don't want all that pressure. So say you're splashing a red removal spell in your green-white deck, I guess that's not a great example because Humble Naturalist doesn't count for that. If you're splashing a red creature in your green-white deck, there we go, then you would want like an Evolving Wilds, a Mountain, and then 2 Humble Naturalists would be like a fine way to splash that one red creature in your deck. I also want to note that if you are going to be taking cards like Migration Path and Savai Crystal, which are kind of clunkier ramp spells that also fix your mana, you're going to want to prioritize powerful cards to splash, because that will help justify spending a card on that effect. Moving on to some final tips for the format, I want to stress that cycling is almost always good. There were many cards that I almost put in the traps section that instead just are good cards, because they are situational, but in the situations where they're good, they're backbreakingly good or they're very potent. So you'll play those cards, and then when they're not good, you'll cycle them away, and when they are good, you will play them and get great effect out of them. So cycling is almost always good, and if you are a cycling deck, you can, like with dedicated payoffs and things like that, you can sometimes just play off-color cyclers to trigger your cyclers. So that's more of an advanced tactic, but if you feel like you can handle it and you have picked up some extra like 1-mana cyclers, consider playing those if you have enough of the payoffs. Moving on to the second final tip, mutate decks need creatures to mutate onto, and vice versa. They also need mutators. So if you have a ton of creatures with mutate, which I do want to stress is not going to be all that common because there are only 5 mutators at the common level, 1 for each color. If you do have a mutate deck that is like blue-green, you've got your mutate deck, you want to make sure you have some creatures that you can mutate onto, so you have like some non-humans that cost less than 3 mana or less than 4 mana, depending on what like your main mutators are. You want to make sure you have cards to mutate onto, which means that sometimes you're going to have to dig into the pile of the 1 mana creatures that are very fringe playable outside of the mutate decks, but that potentially have a very good home in the mutate decks. The things like the 1 mana 1/1 trample, the almighty Brushwag, or the Hatching Egg, or whatever that one is called, the 1 mana O2 that you can mutate onto. Those are the types of cards that you're not going to want to play in almost any deck, but if you have a ton of mutators and you have like 1 2-drop that you can mutate onto, you're going to have to dig into those creatures that you can mutate onto. And also, because there's not an insane amount of mutate creatures, you want to make sure that you don't just take those bad cards, those almighty Brushwags, those Hatching Eggs, or whatever they're called. You don't want to take those little creatures unless you already have some mutators, because I think it's going to be you're going to end up with an unplayable deck if you take all the small creatures but without having actual mutators. And then finally, you can splash with any color combination in this set, though you do need to prioritize it if you're going to be a non-green deck and trying to splash, because there is the Gain Lands, there is Evolving Wilds, there are tools for you to splash. You just have to make sure you prioritize them. I would only recommend doing it if you had a very powerful card, though that goes, the amount of power you need goes down depending on how easily you splash. So green decks will splash things like Blood Curdle very frequently, I think, whereas a red-white deck isn't going to splash Blood Curdle as much, not only because it's an aggressive deck, but because it's a little bit harder to get the tools, but you can splash with any color combination. That is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and in the comments down below, leave hashtag Ikoria ready so that I know you've made it all the way till the end, and so you can brag to all the other people that have scrolled down to the comments. They're like, that person, they've watched all the way to the end of the video. That is going to do it for this one. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in my next video.